Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. The final season of The Bad Batch is going to be out later tonight, and unfortunately, this little show has completely slipped beneath some people's radar. Perhaps because it's an animated show, perhaps it's an animated show for kids, perhaps it's because it's based off of a group of characters that were just a footnote in the final season of the Clone Wars. I guess it'd be easy to disregard The Bad Batch as just another Star Wars anthology story that stands alone and has no effect on the larger saga. But of course, that couldn't be further than the truth. You see, The Bad Batch is actually very important for the Star Wars saga. It might even be crucial in some ways. I think within a few years, we'll see that The Bad Batch will do exactly what the Clone Wars TV show did for the prequel trilogy, but instead for the maligned sequel trilogy. See, when the prequels came out, I was hardly even a teenager, but I still remember how a lot of the older fans just completely hated it. The hatred was less political back then. For the prequels, people were mostly pissed off about the childish elements in the Phantom Menace like Jar Jar Binks. And Episode 2 was just derided by basically everyone, including critics who thought the dialogue and acting in many places was just awful and the pacing was too slow. And for us young fans, we probably thought like all the political nonsense was just boring, but of course that's like my favorite part of Episode 2 now. And then Episode 3 came out and it was, very well received by everyone. But still, it didn't really save an otherwise poorly received prequel trilogy. But then a few years after the prequels ended, the Clone Wars series was greenlit by George Lucas. The TV show was seen as a continuation of the original Tarkovsky Clone Wars series. Now, the first few episodes of this new Clone Wars TV show seemed quite dumbed down and childish, but soon the series picked up pace and started developing a life of its own in a surprisingly serious tone. Originally, the Clone Wars was supposed to show the growth of Anakin Skywalker from Episode 2 to Episode 3, and a lot of that growth would be centered around Anakin being forced to adopt an apprentice. And the Anakin and Ahsoka storyline would be one of the best in the Clone Wars, but ultimately, it was just one storyline out of many storylines. It was the clones and their devotion to each other and to a republic that did not appreciate them that stole the show. And it was the political intrigue, the economic battles behind the scenes that really made the galaxy come to life. It was in the Clone Wars that Palpatine would nationalize the banking system. It was in the Clone Wars that Palpatine would devastate the non-aligned movement started by the Mandalorians. And it was also in the Clone Wars we would see the fall from grace of Asajj Ventress and Maul. The Clone Wars TV show kind of answered all the questions we had about the prequel trilogies, and then it added another 100 questions and answered them on top of that. I think George Lucas, by creating the show, stumbled upon a reality about the Star Wars fan base that I think, sometimes we forget, and that is there is a lot of hunger for Star Wars content, especially back then when we weren't getting that many shows at all. Now, the Clone Wars TV show was supposed to be supplementary, but the quality of some of these story arcs were so high that it actually elevated the prequels from which it came from. This is really a trick that only the Star Wars franchise can rely on. There aren't many franchises that are even close to its size or have as large of a fandom. The Star Wars franchise is so massive that should they fail to make an interesting story come to life in a 2 to 3 hour movie format, they can always just create a 20-hour long TV show to make up for that film's shortcomings. The Clone Wars ultimately ran for 6 seasons, and then it had another 7th season. There were even more seasons planned, but there was basically so much content that you could have all these crazy callbacks in the prequels, and that would make the prequels seem better thought out, richer, and just better than what it originally was. So how does The Bad Batch do the same thing, but for the sequel trilogy? Well, it's no secret that the biggest problem with the sequel trilogy was that it was created in a very disjointed fashion. It's clear now that the individual creators that were signing up for this trilogy didn't even have an overarching storyline when they started filming the first movie. And so, the whole trilogy was very disconnected. For instance, in Force Awakens, J.J. Abrams does an excellent job at setting up the mysterious Supreme Leader Snoke as the bad guy for this entire trilogy. Rian Johnson in the second film seems to pick up that torch from J.J. Abrams and continues to expand on Supreme Leader Snoke. We get to see more of him until he unceremoniously gets killed at the end of that film. And while this was an unexpected shock and twist, and it definitely was very interesting within the confines of the second film, it ultimately robbed the trilogy of a big bad. I mean, that is the thing with trilogies. You do have to build up a big antagonist through the 3 films, and then everything is settled in the 3rd film. And of course, when you killed that bad guy in the second film, no one wants to be in the third movie. And so Star Wars begs J.J. Abrams to come back, and he has to somehow figure out how to fix this massive problem. Abrams realized they couldn't introduce someone new in the third act of a trilogy, it would just be jarring, and so they decided to make the best out of this stupid situation and bring Emperor Palpatine back from the dead. Now, mind you, there were no hints whatsoever that Palpatine was still around in the first two movies. Like, there was zero flashbacks or, foreshadowing, anything like that. And so it's safe to assume that Disney knew that Palpatine would come back at the end of the sequel trilogy in the same way that Lucas knew that Luke and Leia were brother and sister when they hook up in Empire Strikes Back. And so yeah, now we have this really jarring return of Palpatine and a sequel trilogy that, just doesn't work that well for most of the audience. And ever since, all the new Star Wars shows have tried to make this transition a bit less jarring. And these shows have been filling the backstory of how Palpatine cheated death, which of course revolves around cloning. In The Mandalorian, the main plot starts with a contract put out for the young baby Gogurt, a 50-year-old newborn and survivor of Order 66. Gogurt is wanted by the Imperial Remnant leader Moff Gideon, and the former ISB officer has an individual named Dr. Pen Pershing working for him. Eagle-eyed fans were able to point out that the doctor had a symbol on his tunic that was first seen on the staff and cadets at the Kaminoan cloning facilities on Tipico City. People quickly put two to two together and assumed that the Imperial Remnant was trying to figure out what the Kaminoan cloning techniques were and use that technology somehow. And also, baby Gogurt's blood was crucial to this entire process. We get more information about the subplot later in the third season when we see the Shadow Council, which is made up of the Imperial warlords that remain in the galaxy. Brandel Hux actually calls out Moff Gideon about what he's doing with Dr. Pershing.
You held Pershing and were attempting your own experiments on Navarro.
The creation of clones is your obsession, not mine.
That, of course, is a big fat lie, because an episode later, Din Djarin and crew raid Moff Gideon's base, and we see exactly what he's been cooking up.
We're finally going to be perfect. The best parts of me, but improved by adding the one thing I never had. The Force.
If Moff Gideon actually has succeeded in cloning a Force-sensitive version of himself with the Force, that is a big deal. Because in Legends, it was almost impossible to clone a Force-sensitive, and it seems like in canon that also seems to be true. We're not exactly sure why it's impossible to clone a Force-sensitive. It is possible that the Force itself just doesn't want this to happen, and seeing as the Force has unlimited powers, including controlling life, that's definitely like a thing that can be used in the story, right? Now, early attempts in Legends were carried out to make a Fett clone trooper Force sensitive. You also have Darth Vader creating multiple clones of Galen Marek before one was stable and not completely insane. But then you also had the cloning of former Jedi Juros C'baoth by Thrawn, who also wanted to create an army of Force sensitive warriors. But something always would go wrong during these types of processes. I mean, Galen Marek's clones were never really that obedient. Thrawn almost gets killed by C'baoth, so what the heck, right? And so it seems very unlikely that Moff Gideon, an Imperial Remnant warlord, would somehow be able to figure this all out by himself. Remember, the Empire has split apart. He's a warlord like everyone else who's left, and each Imperial leader basically has grabbed whatever resources and projects they could find before fleeing from the New Republic. And so I actually think Moff Gideon has lifted a bunch of research about this cloning process rather than, carry out all the research by himself. Dr. Pershing is not coming up with any new technology, he's just finalizing the process here. I think the root of all the research for cloning a Force-sensitive actually comes from the Bad Batch series. You see, Legends Palpatine, just like canon Palpatine, was obsessed with living forever. And so during the Clone Wars, Legends Darth Sidious attempts to get the Kaminoans to help him create a Force-sensitive body that could be a vessel for him to inhabit if he ever dies. You see, the Jedi can become one with the Force and transition into a Force ghost. The Sith, on the other hand, can cling on to life with such bitterness and hatred that they can possess new bodies and continue living. That is ultimately what Palpatine would do, but of course, inhabiting a clone body that had no midichlorians would mean that Palpatine would not have access to the Force, which of course is unacceptable to him. And so Palpatine wanted rogue Kaminoan scientist Kosai, who was sort of like the Nala Se of Legends, to create that program for him. And eventually he would create an endless amount of clones of himself to use as vessels whenever one of those clones died or degraded. The new sequel trilogy pretty much rips this story directly, but just changes the timeline of events and who's involved. In the canon version, we now have the story of the Bad Batch. And up until now, this story has been relatively unfocused. We have a lot of one-off adventures, some cleanup with the Clone Wars that needs to be talked about, and other things to get through. But at the core of the show is the family that is the Bad Batch, a group of clones who find themselves outsiders to the rest of the clones, which is important.
The Defect Squad's got themselves a new recruit.
And that's because each one of these clones, aside from Echo, have extremely heavy genetic mutations that have been done to them in order to give them an advantage on the battlefield one way or another. And this is a big deal because the basic clone troopers only have some small genetic modifications that alter their behavior and make them more docile and controllable soldiers. And even then, most of the control comes from a tumor control chip that is placed inside of their skull. What Nala Se was able to do with her mutated clones is a lot more difficult. She was able to awaken latent abilities within the Fett genome that I guess no one knew was even hiding there. You have Hunter with his great sense of location and ability to sense electromagnetic signals. You have Tech and his brilliant mind, Crosshair and his reflexes and terrific eyesight. You have Wrecker and his increased size and strength, and you also have Omega and her empathy, perhaps? Or maybe she's Force sensitive. The point here is that Nala Se was able to take a clone template and introduce new genetic traits to it. Now, what if she could also alter the genetic trait that determines how high your midichlorian counts are, affecting an individual's Force sensitivity? That would be the key to everything. I don't think the Empire understood this aspect of Nala Se's research. They simply believe that she's hesitant to do work for them for, morality reasons or something else like that. And ultimately, they try to hunt down Omega because they think she's important to Nala Se and can be used as leverage over the scientists. But I think everyone is misreading the situation. I actually think Kaminoans, especially higher-ranking individuals like Nala Se, are cold and heartless. I don't know if you guys remember Nala Se's very active role in getting Tups killed and trying to cover up the whole inhibitors chip scandal from the Jedi and clones. You could argue that she also got Fives killed during that incident when she drugged him. To think that she somehow had a special connection or even love for Omega, is also technically just a clone, seems very out of character for her. And so when Dr. Royce Hemlock bring Omega to Nala Se at the research facility,
Prime Minister mentioned you had an attachment to the young clone, so I've returned her to you. Perhaps now you will reconsider working on the Emperor's project.
I actually believe what she says.
What he seeks is not possible.
Make it possible.
For whatever reason, the Empire does not understand that Clone Force 99 and Omega were meticulously modified clones and not just the result of some random mutation. Their existence alone should prove to everyone that Nala Se is capable of creating a Force-sensitive clone. And I'm almost certain that the technology that Dr. Pershing uses to help create those clones of Moff Gideon was first pioneered by Nala Se in those earlier years, right after the rise of the New Order. The only thing is Nala Se really did need Omega, not because she has a connection to her, but potentially because Omega's entire body is just one big research project. And Nala Se, being the crafty individual that she is, probably doesn't want the Empire to know that the key to making Force-sensitive clones is hidden inside the Bad Batch. She doesn't want to reveal all of her cards. She's being smart. And heck, maybe that clip of Asajj Ventress that we see alive is one of her first Force-sensitive clones that she'll create afterwards. Okay, probably not. That's very, very unlikely. But yeah, I think this is really the route that Disney seems to be taking with Star Wars from here on out. And slowly but surely, it's going to be shows like The Bad Batch that will continue to fill out the backstory to make sense of the blurry mess that was the sequels. And you know what? This might not work. This might not bring a lot of the older fans back, especially the ones who saw the sequels in theater and, didn't really like it. But for the younger fans who are growing up now with The Bad Batch, well, maybe they really like The Bad Batch, and one day they'll be able to match up all the events in The Bad Batch and one day connect it to the sequels. I think it's a really interesting thought. I've long given up on this idea that Star Wars will live or die because of one movie, TV show, or video game. I think the galaxy is already too rich in flavor and has already come to life because of the sheer amount of content that's been, placed inside of it. Star Wars for me has always been about the setting rather than just the individual stories. But that's just me. Let me know what you guys think though. Do you think it's kind of crazy that Disney does this? Like, instead of creating a well thought out trilogy, they will end up spending the next decade trying to fill in all the gaps to make that trilogy a bit more whole. It's definitely not the ideal situation, but I really can't blame them because it's probably extremely hard to make a trilogy for fans as devoted as the Star Wars audience. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. See you next time.